Hello again, it is me, Mr. David. This is the third final video for the summer module for the HL1 class, Introduction to IB History of the Americas. In the first video, we took a look at the syllabus. In the second video, we explored what is this International Baccalaureate Organization. In this video, we're going to talk a little more specifically about history. As I've mentioned in the other videos, and as you're well aware of at this point, this course is unique because we are not studying the entirety of United States history. We are not studying the entirety of Latin American history. We're picking our topics, we're diving deep, that's what we're going to do. However, in order to understand some of our later concepts and themes, we need to understand some things that happened earlier. So that's what we'll be doing today. Also, we'll be looking a little bit more specifically about the study of history, how we know what we know. I'll give you a little introduction to U.S. history, very, very basic. A little introduction to Latin American history, again, basic. And what I call U.S. Government 101. What are the principles you are going to need to know about U.S. government in order to understand what we're doing? So this will be the longest of the 3 videos, but highly rewarding and a little more exciting than going through the syllabus. So hopefully you have your notebook in front of you, got your pen, and you're ready to write down some of the things we're about to go over. I like to start with this map because, again, when we talk about the history of the Americas, we always think the United States. And of course, the trend throughout the history of the Americas is the United States has always been the top regional power. However, we also can't forget about what the Americas actually is, which is both North and South America. Canada, the United States, Mexico. Now, these countries, Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, they are what we would refer to as Central America. And then you see the countries of South America, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, etc. Now, just so you know, the proper kind of terminology to refer to Mexico all the way into South America would be Latin America. That's kind of the proper name. So when we hear that, that's what we'll be looking at. Now, let's talk a little bit about this concept of history. What is history? What does this mean? Etc. So the first question I'll pose to you is, what is history? Well, you've probably studied history since you've been in maybe the 3rd grade or something like that, but maybe you never really stopped to think, okay, what is history? Well, kind of in very, very basic form, history is the study of past events, experiences, people, etc. And so again, that's very vague, but it's going to help us kind of think about what history means, which is really just a study of the past. Now, something that I just kind of say here, and again, this is kind of a simplistic idea, but what makes history different than some of your other subjects? So, for example, math or science. Well, the reality is, again, there are many answers, but really one of the biggest things we can see is the fact that nothing is absolute in history. We see things in a whole variety of different ways. And so it's really important that, when you're doing math, 2 plus 2, 4, that's just what it is. But in history, we need to really realize that the same thing can be seen in a whole bunch of different ways. So if we can think about that, that's really going to help us explore history better, be better historians, and especially in the IB course when you do your historian work, when you're doing your readings, etc., keeping that kind of in mind. Now, again, I mentioned this in the last slide, but just a couple of things to say here. In math, 2 plus 2 is 4. Okay, can you argue against that? I don't know. Maybe there's some, math PhD working on some dissertation. Oh, 2 plus 2 is actually 5. Well, again, I don't know anything about that. But again, no, we really can't argue against that. That's what it is. Now, let me kind of explain another concept that kind of seems straightforward, but to show you the complexities of history. As you know, the first topic we're going to be studying is the United States Civil War. Well, in 1865, slavery was officially abolished in the United States. That's a fact. Just like 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a fact. However, can you argue against this fact? Well, let me tell you something. Was it actually abolished? If we think about, okay, history is technically gone. They did pass the 13th Amendment and ended slavery, but the reality is that's not necessarily what actually happened. Instead, blacks still had few rights. Certain institutions of slavery lived on. And again, we're going to talk more and more about this as we explore our first and second unit. But nonetheless, I'm trying to show here the concept that, again, straight facts in history are not necessarily that simple. And so, again, we want to keep that in mind as we go through this. We can also ask this question: why was slavery abolished? And again, the picture here, I've included Abraham Lincoln. A lot of times in grade school, students learn about Abraham Lincoln. They learn the nickname the Grand Emancipator because Lincoln was seen as the one that freed the slaves. However, we need to be a little more critical. And so this quote by Lincoln, let's read it. "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving other alone, I would also do that. I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intend no modification of my oft expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free." Wow. Powerful quote, but again, showing us really that Lincoln, although freeing the slaves, didn't necessarily do it because he thought it was the right thing, but doing it because he thought it was what was going to preserve the Union of the United States. And again, we'll talk more about this. Don't worry if you're not so versed with this U.S. Civil War. We'll be really getting into that in big depth. Again, this last concept is huge. The reality is this specific question about why slavery was abolished, the possibilities are endless. The answers are endless. But really, most of our questions in history are endless. And again, there's no set, there's only one answer. No, we have to move way beyond that. And again, same thing can be seen a whole bunch of different ways, whole bunch of different perspectives, etc. Now, one of the big things that we need to take away from this is in history, we need to kind of figure out how do we know what we know. And so far in your history courses, you've probably had a textbook, and in that textbook, everything has been really neatly compacted into, a few hundred pages, and they've gone over these various events, etc. Well, again, thinking about history as a whole, we have to realize it's much more complex than that. So, first off, the question that kind of is posed here is, what are the ways we know about what happened in the past? Well, even though we're not going to be really studying ancient history in this course, a great way we can learn about what happened in the past actually comes from archaeological digs, where we have an archaeologist and his team, and they create a dig site, and they try to figure out things about past civilizations, past cultures, past people, etc. Now, all they have are the remains of people. Many times archaeologists come in, and they have, a civilization they're trying to learn about 5,000 years old. So the question is, how can we learn about these remains of these people? What can these remains tell us? First off, well, we can study their diet. And that might seem so strange, but again, what were the foods they were eating? What were they exposed to? What animals lived around them, etc. We can also study their cultures and rituals. Again, even the earliest of people, we kind of can determine from archaeological digs if they, for example, were deep religious thinkers, if they believed in the afterlife, what they thought about life and death, what they thought about spirits. All those kind of things can kind of tell us a lot of various stuff that's going on. We can also tell the average age, and again, that's a big deal because, well, how do people live longer? Better diets, more access to medicine, type things like that. So again, if a civilization, it looks like the average age of the people that are dying is older, then that tells us they were doing something right. Versus even today when we have low life expectancy and low life averages, there's something wrong. And so again, equally important to identify both, but for especially a lot of these ancient civilizations, that's how we kind of figure a lot of this stuff out. Clothing would be a very big one as well. Again, what are the materials they're next to? What are they around, etc. And so again, that really serves to kind of help us figure out what these historians know, what they do. Others, again, you can think of many other things here that are going to help. But again, I just wanted to focus on this. Our earliest peoples, a lot of them, this is what we have to rely on. But again, the point is, much like a detective, we as historians are trying to figure out the unknown. We're trying to figure out the past, what happened, what went on, etc. And so oftentimes, for our very older cultures and our very older civilizations, oftentimes the archaeological digs are a big way to go. Anyways, I've just included this image of an archaeologist here as he digs in and he tries to figure out, and again, this is just a skeleton, but based on just this skeleton alone, and these body remains that are probably hundreds, if not thousands of years old, he's going to be able to deduce a lot of important things. This is some more sites from archaeological digs, some more things that are kind of found. And wow, look at the intricacies here. And again, we're literally exploring places that are very old and really trying to figure out what exactly they did. For us, the biggest way we are going to find out how historians know what they do is through written sources. And luckily, because of the topics that we'll be looking at, written sources are going to be crucial. Written sources from the period of time is going to be a huge factor for us. And so just a question, what is a name of a written source from the exact time period? This is probably something you learned years and years ago, but just a quick refresher, primary sources. And so again, why are they primary? Well, it's because they come from the time period that we're talking about here. Again, these sources are hugely beneficial, and as we go through the sources and we go through the course, we're going to determine that these sources are incredibly valuable for us. These are literally written by somebody who was there at the time something happened. So they're that first-hand knowledge that we kind of need to bring things together. Now, what are some examples of written sources? Now, again, for now, it's okay to refer to them as primary sources, but we want to get more specific as we move through the course. So, for example, diaries, newspaper articles, magazine articles, books, letters, etc. Just anything written from the time. We just talked about why they're so important, but another thing to realize is that there are limitations and there are issues with these sources. Well, what's the biggest one? These are typically sources that are biased. Again, because the person writing them was present at the time, oftentimes they do have that bias. So again, it doesn't mean that we need to just ignore these sources and just say, it's biased, we can't use them. No. It just instead means we need to be aware of those biases, and we need to kind of realize that, this document may only be taking into account one kind of big perspective. And so that's something big to bring up here. This is a marriage certificate, and so again, this is kind of interesting, and even something as simple as this, a primary source that can definitely tell us some interesting information. So again, we can get so much information from even something so simple as this marriage certificate from Iowa. This is so interesting. This is the oracle bones. These are from ancient China. What they used to do is, and that's why the cracks are there, they write these figures and then they would hit the shell and it would crack in a whole variety of ways. And from that, they would try to interpret what it was being communicated through the oracle bones. So again, even our oldest and later civilizations have some type of written record. Now, this is an interesting one. This is actually from a civilization you might have learned about in world history. This is from the Harappa civilization. Now, let me tell you what's interesting about this civilization. Emerged around the Indus Valley in India around 2800 BC, give or take. And historians and archaeologists, as they've tried to unwrap and try to find more about it, they've found that these people did have a written alphabet, which is exemplified up here, but they've run into a problem, which is that no one yet has been able to translate this alphabet. And so it's kind of an interesting phenomenon. Now, this is a newspaper headline. This is the U.S. is officially at war. What war? Well, 1917. Do you know what war the United States entered in April of 1917? World War I. But again, newspapers are a really, really great tool for us to use as historians. This is an interesting primary source. This is a map. This is actually a map that was found and was used by a historian recently to argue that the Chinese were actually the first to discover the Americas in the early 1400s as opposed to 1492 when Columbus founded it. Again, many historians have said, no, that's crazy, but it's amazing that, again, this just one piece of evidence, somebody can see it as meaning one thing, someone can mean it as seeing something else, someone else probably see it in another way. So really fascinating and big for us to look at. Now, the sources that you are going to really explore in this class, other than primary sources, are secondary sources. So, secondary sources are sources that are written after the fact. So primary, you're there, etc. Secondary, secondhand account after the fact, somebody that wasn't there physically. These are a culmination of a variety of different primary and other secondary sources. So it's really impressive. You're going to take many primary sources, you're going to take many secondary sources and combine them into kind of a cohesive structure. Now, what are some examples of secondary sources? Well, the biggest example you're familiar with are textbooks, but also include our historical books and other relevant information that's written afterwards. And again, there's no textbook for this course, but there are a variety of historical books. Those are secondary sources by themselves. Now, what's the advantage of this? Well, as opposed to a primary source where you just have one singular source, one singular account, secondary sources work to combine a variety of primary sources into kind of one sufficient explanation. So again, imagine you have 10 things thrown at you and you have to make sense of the 10. Again, very simple example, but that's what secondary history sources look to do. Now, what's the biggest disadvantage? Well, the biggest disadvantage is that these are not from the time period, so they could be missing key things. Again, someone tells you about something, that's great, but at the end of the day, you still weren't there. And so we have to kind of bring that into account and think about that. Textbooks especially pose a very big limitation. Now, what is that? Well, textbooks are often incredibly political, and there's a kind of a political agenda, and they're looking to bring in certain groups and certain other things that aren't necessarily relevant. And then the other thing that we often see with textbooks is that there's a huge oversimplification. And again, that's something I try to stress, and that's something that you'll see with all the books you read, and something we kind of said already. History is so complex, and it's really hard to think and make sense of history in just a singular work. This, by the way, is the last book that you'll be reading this year. Secondary source, it's called The Killing Zone, and the United States wages war in Latin America, the Cold War specifically. And so this is a book you'll be reading, and again, I look forward to our discussion of that work and really what it brings to the table. But again, this is an example of a secondary source. The Civil War Dictionary, we saw Lincoln shot 100 eyewitness accounts. So again, think about this combination of all these different accounts that this historian has put into one work. Cry of Liberty, this is the book that you are reading over the summer about the Great Stono Slave Rebellion of 1739. Apostles of Disunion, the Southern Secession Commissioners, and the Causes of the Civil War. Again, that's another book that you'll be reading as well. Really, really good books. Now that we've covered kind of some history basics, I wanted to just introduce U.S. history to you a little bit so you can kind of understand some key elements and kind of see some important stuff. And again, this is very simple, but this is something that will really help you as we explore our topics. First off, if you recall, originally the United States was just 13 colonies. And who was in control? The British, who had expanded overseas. They established these 13 colonies, and Jamestown in Virginia, Massachusetts, all those kind of big things. Now, let me tell you what kind of happened. Britain in the 1600s and the 1700s was busy. A lot of stuff going on in Europe. They were looking to expand elsewhere, etc. So what they basically said was, hey, look, we're not going to really worry about these colonies overseas. Instead, we're going to let them largely govern themselves. We're going to kind of stick away, and, they'll still give us taxes and they'll still do other things, and they'll still ultimately be responsible to us, but we're going to kind of leave them alone so we can do our own stuff over here. And so that concept is known as salutary neglect. Well, you've heard this term probably before, neglect, leaving someone away, ignoring someone, etc. But when we refer to it as salutary neglect, we actually say, hey, look, it was fine for the colonists. And so the colonists kind of governed themselves, had local structures of which to do these things, etc. So anyways, again, this is very simplistic, but when Britain had racked itself into debt after wars in the 1700s, they decided to go after the colonies a little bit harder. And so when they did, because the colonists were so used to being left alone, they decided enough was enough. And they decided, you know what, we're going to be our own country, we're going to break away, etc. And so that's, of course, when they signed the Declaration of Independence, which leads to the American Revolution, and this fight for independence. And of course, what happens? The United States wins. Now, the United States is a very unique case. And why is it a unique case? Well, they are really one of the only countries to ever be originally founded off democracy and these principles of the fact that the people held the power. Now, the reason I put a question mark next to democratic constitution is because of the fact that although definitely democratic, there are definitely limitations. And the biggest limitations is that not everyone was included in this original democratic constitution. Who was not included? Well, our major groups: women, Native Americans, blacks, and actually, to be honest, for quite some time, not rich whites. So again, it was a very limited originally, but at the same time, it did work out to be incredibly successful. So then the question becomes, well, why was this so successful? Why was this experiment in democracy so successful? Well, again, there are several explanations, but again, because these people were used to it and because there were good founding fathers, it was able to bring itself into light. The other question that gets brought up is what limits? Well, again, I already kind of mentioned the groups already, but that's going to be a serious kind of problem throughout, especially our first topic, which is the U.S. Civil War, where obviously we're going to see a certain group, blacks, that are only slaves, essentially, and have no rights, no freedoms, etc. Now, let's talk about U.S. Government 101. And again, this is a really basic conversation of the United States government, but this will help us kind of frame what we talk about and kind of help us understand some of our key concepts. So first off, the U.S. government is what we would consider to be federalist, or based on the premise of federalism. This concept means that power is shared between the state and the federal or the central government. So again, there are currently 50 states, so that means states are allowed to do some things by themselves. So, for example, states control education, but the national government does other things. So, for example, the national government is the only one that is allowed to create peace treaties or have a foreign policy. So the point here is that power is shared between both the national government in D.C., and then the state governments, and included that as local governance as well. So again, that's a guiding principle that makes the United States relatively unique. We are also what is referred to as a republic. Well, what does that mean? A republic just means we do not have a king or a queen. And again, that might seem very obvious, but when the United States was founded in the late 1700s, most countries were governed by a king or a queen. So the fact that we didn't made us kind of unique, and so we are referred to what will be known as a republic. We are also democratic, and again, this is a word you're probably more familiar with, which means power is given to the people. We are a democracy. There's also separation of powers in the United States government. Hence why I've included this picture here on the slide. There are three branches of the United States government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. The legislative is made out of Congress. They are the ones responsible for making laws. And again, that is a long and convoluted process, but at the same time, this will help us for some of our other things to realize they're technically the ones that make the laws. The executive is the president as well as his cabinet, and they are the ones that carry out the laws. So again, Congress makes a law, executive decides to sign it, veto it, etc. The last branch of government is the judicial court, or the judicial branch, which includes the Supreme Court, as well as the other federal courts. 9 people on the Supreme Court. They are the ones that basically are responsible for determining if laws match the Constitution of the United States. So that's their major function, and that's how they're involved in this process. Now, again, these also match up to the branches of government, again, the legislative, executive, and judicial. But the important thing to realize is that power is shared between the 3 groups, and there are checks and balances to ensure no one does anything too crazy. Now, the original Constitution of the United States was made in 1787, and it's kind of they decided they had an original Constitution, which was the Articles of Confederation, did not work out, and so they formed this new Constitution in 1787. That Constitution is still what we have in place today. And so again, it's governed on these ideas of federalism, being a republic, being democratic, etc. However, things have changed since 1787. And so we haven't changed the entire Constitution, but what we have done is we've added amendments. An amendment just means a change. And so 27 amendments have been added to the U.S. Constitution since 1787. The first 10 are known as the Bill of Rights. They were passed almost immediately to get the new Constitution ratified by all the states. But for the most part, our government has been pretty sound and has been relatively consistent for this whole period. In the United States, we also have a 2-party system. Now, it's important to realize, what are the 2 parties today? Well, obviously the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Those have not always been the political parties of the United States. However, this structure of having 2 political parties has been an essential feature of the U.S. government since our existence. And so why do I say that? Well, other countries have what we refer to as a multi-party system. And this is a system where there are not 2, but many parties. And so that makes us a little bit different. And I know you might be saying, well, don't we have the Green Party? Don't we have the Libertarian? Well, yes, but the reality is the way it is structured, those parties really are not able to win big seats or big offices or anything like that, so we don't see them playing much of a factor. Now, what I've included here is a diagram of the executive branch. This is what we would refer to as the cabinet. So obviously the president's at the head, then obviously the vice president, and we have our different cabinet departments and our different secretaries. What is the cabinet? Well, they're the ones responsible for advising the president. And so the most important one would be the Secretary of State. They're in charge of foreign policy. When we get into the later part of the year, we'll definitely be talking about a lot of different Secretary of States and what they did. But we see the government is big and there's a lot of things going on. This is what I was talking about with federalism, and again, this is the idea that powers are split between the national government and the states, and what you see here is that certain government powers are only given to the national government. So for example, only the national government can declare war. Again, you can imagine how odd it would be if the state of California decided, we're going to go to war against France. Nah, that doesn't make any sense. So they're the only ones responsible for doing that, as well as coining money. Again, it's the reason why the same money is used here in the United States, whether or not you're in California, whether or not you're in Texas, etc. You see the power reserved to the states, establishing local governments, schools, elections. Those are big. Public safety. Hence why we have, for example, the California Highway Patrol, the Los Angeles County Sheriff Department. That's a state power. But in the middle, you see powers that are actually given to both. So, for example, the power to raise taxes. Well, that's why you have your federal tax as well as your state tax, and you have sales tax, criminal justice. Some prisons are state prisons, some are federal prisons, etc. Building roads. Again, some roads are interstate roads, some states are intrastate, meaning they're within. And so that's what we kind of see going on here. Now, this includes the election results going all the way to 2012. And so what you see here is that there's always been two parties, and in the middle, there's been a third party that's gotten some votes, but what you can tell is they really haven't made much of a difference for the vast majority of things. So that's something interesting. But again, it's important to realize that, again, we are a two-party system. This is what is a six-party system. So again, this is in other countries. They have a multi-party system. And so again, we are different than that in the sense that we're only two. But I just wanted to include this graphic so you can see the difference. Now, this is what we call the preamble to the United States. And you might have heard this expression before, we the people. And this is its original form. And then this is it so you can read it a little bit easier. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our prosperity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Now, why did I include this? Because this embodies what the United States is. Look at that wording. We, the people of the United States, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. What does that mean? The government has no power without the power of the people. The people have given the United States government its power. And so again, that's a crucial concept, but just something to keep in mind about really what it means to be an American, and what is American government and American principles all about. These are the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. These are referred to as the Bill of Rights, passed almost immediately. These are probably amendments that you're familiar with. The First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. The Second Amendment, been in the news a lot lately, the right to bear arms. These other amendments that, again, are just trying to give people power and make sure the government does not have some overbearing influence over what people do. These are the additional amendments, and again, as we go through our studies, we will be looking at some of these a little more carefully, and so I look forward to doing that together. This is just the process for amending the Constitution. It's actually a pretty rigorous process. You don't need a simple majority. You need a 3/4 majority. So with that being the case, the Constitution is not amended very often. Now let's talk just briefly about the other parts of America. Now, obviously, Canada up to the north. Now, I have to be honest, we will not be talking about Canada very much in this course, but Canada was a British colony and largely was influenced by what Britain did. So, for example, when World War I happened, well, when Britain decided to go to World War I, Canada said, we're going to World War I. And so we see a lot of that similarity going all the way through. Now, the other parts of America that I really want to be talking about is Latin America. Well, as opposed to the British North American colonies that would become the United States, the colonies of Latin America were Spanish and Portuguese. Now, these colonies were very different from the U.S. and the British, primarily in the sense that, remember what we said about the U.S., or what would be the United States colonies, the British basically left them alone. These colonies were very, very seriously watched by the Spanish and Portuguese. What we also had was a social class system based upon whether or not you were Spanish So if you were born in Spain, you were at the very top, and basically the further down you went was based on whether or not you were born in actually Latin America. So what you have is kind of an oppressive social class structure. However, in the early 1800s, very much inspired by the neighbors up with the United States and their success with democracy, they decided, let's have a revolution. And so what we see is a variety of Latin American revolutions. And by the 1820s, almost all of Latin America had become independent. Now, when they became independent, it's not exactly the same as the United States, who was able to kind of transition into this nice democracy. Everything's all good, everything seems all great, etc. Not exactly. And instead, what we see is that the people that became the first rulers of these new Latin American countries are what we refer to as caudillos, or strongmen. And these guys ruled these countries with an iron fist. They really only cared about money. They really only cared about their military. And what you had was very oppressive rule. And also, the leaders of these places being changed, not through elections like in the United States, but instead by military and by death and things like that. Now, it's important to realize that Latin America has had issues and problems in the 19th and 20th century. There were foreign powers that were trying to get involved and things like that. In the 20th century, and again, we'll really be looking at Latin America very closely in the second semester when we get to the Cold War, we have a lot of issues of poverty and a lot of issues with non-democratic governments and things like that. So just something to kind of keep in mind here. Today, issues still persist. Although there's been some success, there's still kind of problems. It would be what we'd consider, for the most part, a developing region where we do still see high levels of poverty, kind of an absence of a middle class. Some countries have been really good at growing into democracies. Others, it has been just awful. So again, it's a very interesting region for us to study. And again, it's a region that oftentimes does not get studied in high school. So I'm looking forward to studying it with you. The last thing that I've included here is just a link from Freedom House, which is a nonprofit organization which assesses how free countries are. And so this is the 2018 report. So if you want to go ahead and explore that, you can kind of see how Latin America looks compared to other countries. And what you'll see is some levels of democracy in some places, others not so much. Anyways, thank you so much. I look forward to discussing this course further. And again, at this point, you should be moving on to doing your summary analysis of Cry Liberty. Have a great one.